Hello, this is Reagan Brewer, and I am presenting today on predicting success in reentry employment programs. So, over the last 20 or 30 years, we've had this tough on crime era. And what has happened is that incarceration rates have significantly exceeded population growth rates, while actual crime rates have remained steady and in line with population growth rates. So if you combine that problem with the privatization of the prison systems, you have this enormous overcrowding in the prison system, and you have this huge taxpayer price tag. So the cost to feed and house one inmate each year is $26,000. That's nearly $10,000 more than the annual wages for someone making minimum wage in Illinois, which is about $17,000. So this is an enormous amount that we are paying per year. Most inmates, though, will actually be released from prison at some point. So the vast majority of inmates are people that have not committed, murder and rape and kidnapping and things like that. The vast majority of people that are in the prison system right now are people that have committed crimes like possession, distribution, burglary, unlawful use of a weapon. These are things that they will eventually be released for. And what that comes out to is about 700,000 individuals being released on an annual basis from our prison system. That's a huge, huge amount of people that are going back to their communities. And so we need to be aware of what happens to those individuals and those families and those communities when those folks return. But what we know is that recidivism is significantly reduced with employment, and the better the job, the less likely the individual is to recidivate. So despite the tough on crime era and this tough on crime political environment that we're in right now, the return on investment studies have demonstrated that there's a very significant return on investment for reentry programs for former offenders. If you invest just under $1,200 into reentry programs, you get a $6,800 savings in future criminal expenses. That's pretty big return on investment. We also know that recidivism is significantly reduced for individuals who complete these types of programs. So they're more likely to get a job if they're able to complete these reentry employment programs. I'd like to quickly run through a couple of definitions. When I'm referring to reentry, I am referring to all activities and programming conducted to prepare ex-convicts to return safely to the community and live as law-abiding citizens. For employment training can take on a lot of different names and a lot of different forms. It could be work readiness preparation, it could be career development, it could be it could be vocational training where the program is preparing that individual with a specific skill set that's going to lead them to a job. All of these things I'm kind of lumping together under post-release reentry employment training programs. So I'm looking at a number of different types of programs, but I'm kind of combining those all into one category for the sake of this particular project. My first hypothesis is that former offenders will be more likely to succeed in post-reentry employment programs if they have support networks and family ties. So the idea here is that as they're going through the reentry employment programs, my theory is that if they have support, if they've got family around them, particularly parents and siblings that can kind of be their cheerleaders as they're going through these programs and saying, yes, you can do it, you're gonna be successful, that's gonna lead to an increased amount of success in these programs. The second hypothesis that I am testing is looking at education level. And so my theory here is that the higher the education level, the more likely the ex-offender is to be successful in that reentry program. So if someone is coming out of prison and they don't have a GED or uh, a high school diploma, they're going to be much less successful in these employment programs than someone that's coming out with a GED and maybe even a little bit of college. My data sources were interviews with subject matter experts, which I will talk more about in a minute, interviews with former offenders, and I do have to say that some of the interviews subjects that I had were both subject matter experts in their field of working with the criminal justice system or working with former offenders, and they were actually former offenders themselves, so they had a very unique perspective. And then I also pulled data from the reentry employment programs at the Jane Addams Resource Corporation, which is a workforce development organization that serves a wide audience but does have a focus on ex-offenders. My interviews were conducted face-to-face and over the phone. These were some of the organizations that I interviewed. Primarily, I talked to program directors, job developers, employment coaches, and I did talk to one person that was the policy director at the Safer Foundation. So besides the Safer Foundation, who works primarily with ex-offenders, the St. Leonard's Ministries also works with ex-offenders, Cabrini Green Legal Aid. The Community Renewal Society targets violence prevention programs, but they end up working a lot with ex-offenders, as with CFL that has a program with the Vocational Rehabilitation Impact Center through the Cook County Department of Corrections. I interviewed Jewish Vocational Services out in Boston and talked about some of the challenges there, and then the Director of Training Services at the Jane Addams Resource Corporation. The cases that I looked at were only people with felony convictions, and what I did was I tested correlations between whether they were placed in a job and retained that job, and marital status, having children, and their education levels. So I compared being placed in a job and retaining that job with each of those three things. Just to get a quick snapshot of what the participant pool looked like, 3/4 of the individuals in the data set had never been married. They were single. 15% were married at the time that we collected the data, and 10% had been divorced or separated from their spouse or partner. And also 3/4 had never had children, and only 1/4 did have children. In terms of education level, 37% had at least some college classes, so they had a high school diploma and had probably taken a couple of community college courses, but had not received their associate's or bachelor's degree. 20% had earned their GED. Close to 20% had also completed high school and received a high school diploma, and only 16% had no high school diploma. Much smaller percent had higher level education, about 8%, either an associate's or a bachelor's degree. So after looking at the data, what I found out from looking at all of the ex-felons as a whole was that there was no correlation between marital status and job placement and retention. There was also no correlation between having children and job placement, but there was a slight correlation between having children and actually retaining that job. So the fact that you have a child might not really have an impact on whether you get a job or not, but once you do have that job, you're maybe more motivated to keep it. And then there was a slight correlation between education and job placement and retention. And so because there was very little or no evidence of a correlation between having a job or getting a job and keeping that job with having children, being married, or your education level. What I did was I broke the population down further between male and female ex-felons. And so what I then found out was, if just looking at the females, there was a slight correlation between having a child and job placement and retention for women, but there was still no correlation between having a child and job placement and retention for men. There was a slightly higher correlation for men than for women when it comes to education and job placement and retention. So for men, there was a little bit more of a correlation between education and placement than there was for women. For women, education seemed to play, you know, no role really in whether they were able to get a job and retain it. However, women tended to retain their jobs at a higher rate than men. It wasn't too much higher, but it was a 93% is pretty significant, significantly high retention rate for this population. 86% is still really strong for men, but women are still just a little bit higher there. So while I was a bit shocked that the correlations were so weak, it really made sense and became clear when I was interviewing primarily the subject matter experts. They pretty much said family, having children, having a spouse has very, very little to do with the motivation one has when they're in a reentry employment program. A couple of the people talked about, being sick and tired of being sick and tired, just being tired of being in this, on this path where you're, beg, borrowing, and stealing all the time. And so, and committing crimes in order to make your life work. And that's not working. And so there was this sense of people are just, they get tired of doing this. They don't want to do this anymore. The peer group has a very significant negative effect, according to the people that I interviewed. Much bigger effect than your family or your spouse or your siblings would have is really going to be your peer group. A lot of people talked about the population of ex-offenders that they work with being out of touch with the demands of the job market and out of touch with what an employer's expectations are for them. And then the other thing is that ex-offenders didn't really see that their criminal background was a barrier. So they, everybody that they know has a criminal background, and so why would that make it a barrier? Because everybody has one. Other things that were mentioned were that there is a lack of positive role models in the neighborhoods that are affected by high incarceration rates. There are just not a lot of men that are getting up every day and going to work. There's also a sense of hopelessness and powerlessness that, people in these communities, they've been historically poor, historically, in these types of situations where they just have no power over, their lot in life. They feel like they are just, hopeless. And especially with ex-offenders, they have this kind of scarlet letter that's going to follow them around for the rest of their lives, and they are hopeless that that is ever going to go away, that people are ever going to see them as anything except for an ex-offender. So future studies really need to look at those larger support networks and some of the other things that are going on with ex-offenders that are returning to the community. Housing is an issue, discrimination is an issue, substance abuse is an issue, lack of role models is an issue. In conclusion, as one of my interviewees put it, any program is better than no program when it comes to ex-offenders, and that's regardless of the characteristics of that particular offender. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope you was informative.